The Lord of Light is, by all accounts, a discerning deity. His priests burn offerings at dusk and dawn. They read the future in tongues of flame. They birth shadows that murder kings in their beds. So when Melisandre of Ashai knelt before the great fire pit on Dragonstone's volcanic shore and begged Ruller to deliver unto Stannis Baratheon a champion worthy of the war to come, she expected something magnificent, a warrior wreathed in holy fire, a knight pulled from legend, a hero befitting the one true king. What she got was a man in a red and black leather suit holding half a chimichanga. He landed face first on the obsidian sand, rolled twice, and popped to his feet with the casual energy of someone who had fallen through dimensional rifts before and found the whole thing mostly inconvenient. The fire behind him swirled and collapsed. The portal sealed with a crack that shook Dragonstone's ancient walls. Melisandre staggered back. Sir Davos Seaworth drew his sword. The Queen's men formed a half-circle with spears leveled. The man in red looked at them. He looked at the volcanic fortress. He looked at the medieval army. Then he looked up, not at the sky, not at the smoke, but at something none of them could see. "Okay," he said. "Game of Thrones. That's where we're doing this." Cool. Cool. I was told this was going to be a Marvel team-up thing, but no. Apparently my agent booked me a YouTube crossover script. He took a bite of the chimichanga. "At least it's not DC." Melisandre's ruby choker pulsed with heat. She stepped forward, firelight painting her red robes in shades of blood and prophecy. "You were delivered from the flames," she said, in her voice carrying the certainty of a woman who had burned men alive for less impressive miracles. "The Lord of Light has sent you." "Lady, I don't know who your lord is, but I was sent by a very stressed screenwriter who needed to hit a 10,000-word count." He looked at Davos. "You, Onion Knight, right? Liam Cunningham. Loved you in this. Tell me something. Is this season 1? 2? Because if Ned Stark's still got his head, I've got some urgent information." Davos exchanged a glance with Melisandre. The stranger spoke the common tongue, but nothing he said made sense. "Seize him," said Stannis Baratheon from the steps above. Wade Wilson, known across multiple universes, film franchises, and at least 2 R-rated box office records as Deadpool, was dragged into the stone drum tower of Dragonstone with his hands bound in chains that he absolutely could have broken, but chose not to because, in his words, "I want to see where this goes." They put him in a cell carved from volcanic rock. Damp, dark, the kind of medieval accommodations that made him nostalgic for the Weapon X facility, which was saying something because that place had been a nightmare of medical torture and involuntary mutation. He sat on the stone bench and addressed the wall. "So here's the setup. Melisandre, Fire Witch, questionable fashion sense, big into burning people, accidentally summoned me instead of whatever prophesied hero she was going for. I'm on Dragonstone. Stannis Baratheon is upstairs grinding his teeth and thinking about the Iron Throne. But the War of the Five Kings is in full swing, which means Robb Stark is winning battles and about to lose a war. Joffrey is being Joffrey, which is to say, the worst. And somewhere out in the desert, a very pretty blonde woman has 3 baby dragons and a messiah complex." He paused. "Also, I literally cannot die, which in a show famous for killing everyone is going to be, and I cannot stress this enough, hilarious." Melisandre visited him at midnight. The torchlight made her shadow dance against the cell walls in ways that shadows shouldn't dance, bending at angles that defied the flame's direction, lengthening toward Wade like curious fingers. "You healed," she said. Wade glanced at his wrists. The guards had been rough with the chains. The skin had torn. It had grown back in the time it took them to lock the door. "Yeah, that's sort of my whole deal. Ruller grants his champions gifts, resurrection, visions, immunity to flame. She studied him with eyes that reflected fire even where no fire burned. "What has the Lord of Light granted you?" An incredible sense of humor and a face like an avocado, had a baby with another, older, more disgusting avocado. He leaned forward. "But I'll tell you what your Lord didn't grant me, Red. A reason to care about Stannis Baratheon's claim to a chair made of swords. I've read the script. Well, watched it. 8 seasons. I know how this ends for everyone in this castle." Melisandre's expression didn't change, but the ruby at her throat flared. "You claim to see the future. I claim to have watched the future. On HBO, with takeout. There's a difference. But it won't matter to you because you're going to hear what you want to hear, which is that I'm a sign from your fire god. And honestly, maybe I am. Interdimensional fire portals aren't exactly science." She was quiet for a long time. "Then, what do you see for Stannis?" Wade looked at her. For a half second, the comedy dropped. Underneath the mask, the literal one and the figurative one, something shifted. He knew what happened to Stannis. He knew about Shireen, the pyre, the screaming. He knew Melisandre's faith would burn a child alive. "I see a man who's going to lose everything," Wade said, because the people around him confused cruelty with devotion. The silence that followed was the kind that Dragonstone was built for. Heavy, volcanic, ancient. Then Wade grinned under his mask. "But hey, what do I know? I'm just the comic relief. If you want to see more characters enter different universes, hit that subscribe button and drop the name of a character and the universe you'd want to see them in down in the comments below. When you play the Game of Thrones, you win or you die." Melisandre left without another word, but she didn't order him executed. And in a world where fire priests tended to burn first and ask questions during the screaming, that was practically Wade escaped Dragonstone 3 days later, not because the cell couldn't hold him, but because the food was terrible and Stannis' court had the collective personality of a tax audit conducted in a cemetery. The method was simple. He dislocated both thumbs to slip the manacles. Healing factor snapped them back in seconds. Killed no one because even he had standards about murdering extras who hadn't done anything wrong. Stole a rowboat and rowed southeast toward the mainland with the confidence of a man who had absolutely no idea how medieval naval geography worked. "I should point out," he told the open sea, "that I am rowing toward King's Landing, the capital, Joffrey's playground, the single most politically dangerous city on this continent, and I'm doing it on purpose because..." He paused to row. "Because that's where the interesting people are. Winterfell is cold and full of doomed honorable types. Dragonstone is Stannis. King's Landing has Tyrion Lannister, and frankly, if I'm going to be stuck in a medieval death politics show, I want to be stuck with the one character who appreciates a good punchline." He washed ashore south of the city and walked through the Gate of the Gods at midday, which should have been difficult given that he was wearing skin-tight red leather in a world of tunics and chainmail. But King's Landing had 1 million people and a thriving population of drunks, mummers, foreign sellswords, and individuals in flea bottom whose outfits made Deadpool look conservative. Nobody stopped him. "That's the thing about this city," he narrated, stepping over something in the gutter that he chose not to identify. "So everyone's so busy scheming against each other that a heavily armed man in a costume can just walk around. It's like New York, but with more open sewage and fewer food trucks." He found Tyrion Lannister in a brothel. Of course he did. It was season 2. Tyrion was Hand of the King, drunk on the power and the wine in roughly equal measure, trying to outmaneuver his sister while managing a war his nephew was too stupid to fight and his father was too far away to supervise. He sat in a private room with Bronn, a sellsword whose moral compass pointed exclusively toward gold, and Podrick Payne, a squire so unassuming that history would remember him primarily for an incident in this very brothel that no one ever adequately explained. Wade walked in, sat down, poured himself wine from Tyrion's flagon, and said, You're shorter in person." Bronn's hand went to his sword. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. This was a man who had been insulted by kings and kinslairs and his own father at regular intervals since birth. A stranger commenting on his height was Tuesday. "And you're the maddest person to walk into a room I'm drinking in," Tyrion replied, "which given my family is genuinely impressive. Who are you?" "Name's Wade Wilson. I'm from another dimension. I can't die. I know the future, and nobody believes me about either thing. I also know that you're the smartest person in this city, that your sister is currently plotting something that involves wildfire, and that your father is going to—" He stopped, looked up at nothing. "Actually, I probably shouldn't spoil that one. It involves a crossbow and a privy, and it's one of the best scenes in the show, up at season 4. Chef's kiss." "He's insane," Bronn said. "Obviously," said Tyrion, "but insane people are occasionally useful, and he mentioned wildfire, which is a subject I'm currently quite interested in." He studied Wade with the calculating gaze that had kept him alive in a family that considered him a mistake. "You said you know the future. Prove it. Your sister has been stockpiling wildfire under the city using the Alchemists' Guild. She inherited the obsession from the Mad King, who wanted to burn the whole place down rather than let Robert Baratheon take it. Jaime killed him to stop it. The caches are still down there. Thousands of jars, green fire, burns on water, burns through stone, burns through everything. And eventually," Wade leaned back, "she's going to use them. Sept of Baelor. Big boom. Takes out the Tyrells, the High Sparrow, and a significant chunk of the city's religious architecture." The room was very quiet. Bronn's hand was still on his sword. Tyrion's wine was untouched, which for Tyrion was the equivalent of a normal person fainting. "The wildfire caches," Tyrion said slowly. "I've been investigating those. I discovered them myself only days ago. That information is not public." "It's not public in your world." "And what world are you from?" "One where this is all a story," Wade said. "A really good one, actually. George R.R. Martin wrote the books. HBO made the show. The ending was divisive. I mean, really divisive. Your boy Bran ends up king and the fans never recovered. But the journey, peak television, and right now, we're in the good seasons." Tyrion looked at Bronn. Bronn looked at Tyrion, and neither of them understood half of what the stranger said, but the wildfire detail was too specific, too accurate, and too dangerous to dismiss. "Suppose," Tyrion said, with the careful tone of a man constructing a logical framework around something that defied logic, "that you do know things you shouldn't. What exactly do you want?" Wade considered this. It was, he realized, the first time someone in Westeros had asked him what he wanted rather than what he was. And underneath the jokes, underneath the healing factor and the fourth wall breaks and the near-constant narration to an audience that existed in another reality, he found that the answer was surprisingly simple. "I want to save some people," he said. "Specific people. People who die because nobody warned them in time or because the warning came from the wrong messenger. I know who lives and who dies in this story, and I know I'm not supposed to change it. Narrative structure, dramatic stakes, the whole storytelling contract with the audience. But I'm here now, and I've never been great with rules." Tyrion studied him for a long moment. Then he picked up his wine and drank. "I don't believe you're from another world," Tyrion said. "But I believe you know things, and in King's Landing that makes you either the most valuable man in the city or the most dangerous." He refilled Wade's cup. "Let's find out which." Within a week, Wade Wilson had become the most confusing problem in King's Landing, which in a city that contained Cersei Lannister, Petyr Baelish, and a 13-year-old king with a crossbow fetish was a considerable achievement. Tyrion kept him close. Not out of trust. Trust in King's Landing was a currency that inflated to worthlessness every time someone opened their mouth. But out of the pragmatic recognition that a man who could predict political movements with eerie accuracy was better kept as an asset than allowed to wander. He installed Wade in a guest chamber in the Tower of the Hand and introduced him to the small council as a foreign sellsword with useful intelligence contacts. Sellsword, Bronn muttered. He doesn't even carry a proper sword. I carry 2 katanas, Wade said. They're like swords, but more anime. And also, I have 12 knives, 4 grenades, which won't work here because the pins are rusted from the ocean, thanks for nothing, Dragonstone rowboat, and a healing factor that means you could cut me in half, and I'd just be 2 very angry halves that grow back into 1 angry whole. He's mad, said Grandmeister Pycelle. We've established that, Tyrion said. He's also been right about the wildfire caches, the movement of Stannis' fleet, and the name of Varys' tailor, which is a detail I genuinely cannot explain. Varys, present at the small council meeting in his usual capacity as the most dangerous person in any room who looked the least dangerous, watched Wade with the expression of a man who had built a career on knowing everything and was now confronted with someone who might know more. From his network of little birds, children who whispered secrets through the walls of every castle in the realm, had returned no information about a Wade Wilson from any kingdom, free city, or sellsword company in the known world. The spider did not like unknowns. Unknowns disrupted the web. Tell me, Varys said, with a smile that was warm in the way that a fire is warm if you're standing too close. Where did you say you were from? Saskatchewan, originally. Then a military black ops program that gave me cancer, cured the cancer, gave me superpowers, and made me look like a topographical map of the moon's ugliest crater. After that, a series of films with declining box office returns but increasing critical acceptance. He paused. In this continuity, and I fell through a fire portal because the Red Lady on Dragonstone was trying to summon a messiah and got me instead. It's a lateral move. You speak in riddles. I speak in truth. You just don't have the cultural context. But here's something in your context. Wade leaned across the table. You serve the realm. That's your line. That's what you tell everyone. But what you actually serve is an idea of stability that you're willing to betray anyone to achieve. You've been writing letters to Illyrio Mopatis in Pentos about a Targaryen restoration because you think Daenerys or her brother, well, just Daenerys now, Viserys got the Golden Crown treatment, will bring better order than the Baratheon Lannister mess. You play every side because you believe the realm matters more than any king. The silence around the small council table could have been cut with Valyrian steel. Varys' smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes went cold and calculating in a way that had preceded the quiet disappearance of several inconvenient people over the years. Interesting, Varys said. I told you, Tyrion said, taking a drink. He knows things. It was Cersei who escalated the situation. She learned of the stranger through her own informants. Lesser birds, clumsier spies, but effective enough, and had him summoned to her chambers in the Red Keep on the 3rd day. The queen sat in green silk with a goblet of arbor gold, and the expression of a woman who viewed all men as either tools or obstacles. They tell me you cannot be killed, she said. Aye, they tell you, right. Prove it. Wade looked at the ceiling. She's going to have someone stab me. For the record, I want the audience to know that this is very rude, even by Lannister standards, which are, and I say this with love, rock bottom. Cersei nodded to Sir Meryn Trant of the Kingsguard, who drove a sword through Wade's midsection with the enthusiasm of a man who genuinely enjoyed hurting people, which, to be fair, Meryn Trant absolutely did. Wade looked down at the sword in his gut. Ow. He looked at Cersei. Was that supposed to prove something to you, or was it just for fun? Because with your family, honestly, it could go either way. Trant withdrew the blade. Blood pooled on the stone floor. And then, in the firelight of Cersei's chambers, the wound closed. Skin knitted over muscle, muscle reattached to organ. When within 30 seconds, Wade Wilson was whole, blood-stained and annoyed. Cersei's eyes went wide. Then they went narrow. Then they went to the place behind her eyes where she kept her schemes, and Wade could practically hear the gears turning because he'd seen this exact look on her face across 8 seasons of television, and it never, ever led to anything good. "You will serve the crown," Cersei said. It was not a question. "Here's the thing, Your Grace." And I use that title loosely because, actually, no, I'll save that rant. He stepped closer, and Meryn Trant's sword came up again. Wade ignored it. "I know what you are. I know what you do. I know about the children. I know about Jaime. I know what you did to Robert with the strong wine and the boar. I know about the wildfire under this city. And I know that before this story is over, you burn the Sept of Baelor with everyone inside it. Your last surviving son throws himself out a window, and you sit on the Iron Throne over a city of ashes." He tilted his head. "So when I say I'm not going to serve you, understand that it's not because I'm brave. It's because I've seen the show and I know exactly how serving you ends." For the first time in a very long time, Cersei Lannister had no response. Wade turned and walked out. Meryn Trant moved to stop him. Wade broke his wrist in 2 places without looking and kept walking. "That's going to be a problem," he said to no one visible. "She's going to send people to kill me now. Lots of people. It won't work, but it'll be annoying, and I just got blood on the only outfit I have." He tried to save Ned Stark. This is the part of the story where the comedy thins and something raw surfaces. Because Wade Wilson, for all the jokes, all the fourth wall fractures, all the performed irreverence, was a man who knew the script and couldn't bear to watch the good ones die on schedule. Eddard Stark was in the black cells beneath the Red Keep, imprisoned for treason. The charge was a lie built on other lies. He'd discovered the truth about Cersei's children, tried to do the honorable thing, and honor had landed him in a dungeon because honor in King's Landing was a synonym for stupidity. He would be taken to the steps of the Sept of Baelor. Joffrey would promise mercy. Joffrey would demand his head instead. And Ned Stark would kneel, and Eileen Payne's great sword would fall. And when the man who was arguably the moral center of the entire story would die in front of his daughters because a boy king wanted to feel powerful. Wade knew the date. He knew the hour. He knew the route from the cells to the Sept. He went to Tyrion first. "I need you to delay the execution." The execution ordered by the king. The king is 13, clinically sadistic, and not actually the rightful heir, which you already know because you're smart enough to count the months between Cersei's wedding and Joffrey's birth. Delay it. 1 day. Give me 1 day. And what will you do with 1 day? Get Ned Stark out of the city. Tyrion set down his wine, which meant this was serious. "You're asking me to commit treason against my nephew, my sister, and my father's political interests to save a man who publicly accused my family of illegitimacy?" "Yes. Why would I do that?" Wade sat down. He pulled off his mask. Something he rarely did because the scarred, ravaged landscape of his face tended to end conversations. But he needed Tyrion to see him, the real him, not the character, not the joke, the man underneath who had been cut apart and put back together so many times that the scars had scars. Because Ned Stark's death starts a war that kills hundreds of thousands of people, Wade said. His son Robb marches south for revenge and wins every battle and loses the war at a wedding where they murder him, his mother, and his wolf while a band plays the Rains of Castamere. Tywin orchestrated it. The Freys did the cutting, the Boltons held the knife. Now it's the worst thing in this entire story, and it happens because Ned Stark dies on those steps. Tyrion stared at him, the scars on Wade's face. the certainty in his voice, the way he described events that hadn't happened yet with the grief of someone who had witnessed them. "You truly believe this?" Tyrion said. "I don't believe it. I've seen it. Episode 9, Season 3, The Rains of Castamere. Highest rated episode until the Battle of the Bastards. The internet broke. People cried. I cried, and I once watched my own hand get cut off and made a joke about it." Tyrion was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Even if I believed every word, and I'm not saying I do, my father controls this. Cersei controls this. Joffrey is a wild animal with a crown. I'm Hand of the King only because my father is fighting a war and needed someone to manage the monster he put on the throne. I don't have the power to stop an execution. Then help me get into the black cells. That I can do." He got into the black cells. Varys' secret passages, the ones that ran through the walls of the Red Keep like veins through a body, were accessible if you knew where to look. And Tyrion knew where to look because Tyrion made it his business to know every useful secret in the castle. Wade found Ned Stark in the dark. The Lord of Winterfell sat against the wall with his leg broken and his spirit intact in the way that only truly honorable men managed, which was to say stubbornly, pointlessly, and with complete disregard for the fact that honor was actively getting him killed. "Lord Stark?" Ned looked up. Out in the torchlight, he was gaunt, weeks of imprisonment, bad food, worse conditions, but the eyes were still Stark eyes, grey, northern, unflinching. "Who are you?" "A friend, sort of. I'm from..." "Okay, the full explanation involves alternate dimensions, a Canadian military program, and a media franchise worth billions of dollars, so let's skip it. Short version. I know you're going to die tomorrow. Joffrey's going to take your head on the steps of the Sept. Your daughter Sansa is going to watch. Your daughter Arya is going to be in the crowd, and it's going to start a war that destroys your family." Ned's jaw tightened. "Varys told me Joffrey would offer mercy, that I'd be allowed to take the black." "Varys told you what he wanted to be true. Joffrey doesn't do mercy. Joffrey does cruelty. Arns and everyone around him is too afraid or too strategic to stop him. I'm here to get you out. I won't run." Wade had expected this. Of course he had. He'd watched the show. He knew Eddard Stark. Honor was the man's defining trait and his fatal flaw, and no argument from a scarred stranger in red leather was going to override 2 decades of Sean Bean's career trajectory, pointing toward exactly one outcome. "Lord Stark, Ned, your children need you alive. My children need me to be the man I taught them to be. Your children need a father." The silence in the black cells was absolute. Water dripped from stone. Somewhere above, the Red Keep went about its business of treachery and power, and Ned Stark looked at Wade Wilson with the sadness of a man who had already made peace with what was coming. "If you truly know the future," Ned said, then protect my daughters. That is all I ask." Wade stared at him. The joke was gone. The fourth wall was gone. There was nothing but a dying man asking a stranger to save his children, and Wade Wilson, immortal, unkillable, perpetually regenerating Wade Wilson, felt something that his healing factor couldn't fix. He left the black cells knowing Ned Stark would die in the morning, and for the first time since arriving in Westeros, he didn't have a joke about it. Ned Stark died on the steps of the Sept of Baelor on a bright autumn morning while his daughter screamed and a boy king smiled. Wade watched from the crowd. He could have intervened. He'd thought about it all night, running the math on healing factor versus Kingsguard, calculating how many of Joffrey's soldiers he could cut through before Ilan Payne's sword came down, imagining the sequence in cinematic terms because his brain still processed reality as scenes and acts and beats, even when reality was a man kneeling with his neck on a block. He could regenerate from anything they did to him. He could have cut a path to the steps, killed the executioner, grabbed Ned, and fought his way to the gates. And then what? He looked at the audience. Not the crowd in the square, them too, and the thousands of King's Landing small folk who'd gathered because executions were entertainment in a city that couldn't afford theater. But the other audience, the one beyond the screen, the one listening to this story right now. "Here's the thing nobody tells you about knowing the future," he said, quietly enough that the people around him thought he was praying. "You think it's power. You think if you just know what's coming, you can stop it. But the future isn't a puzzle you solve. It's a river. You can throw rocks in it. You can stand in the middle and scream. But the water goes where the water goes, and the rocks just make different splashes." The sword fell. Sansa Stark fainted. Arya Stark was caught by Yoren of the Night's Watch and pulled away before she could see the aftermath, though she would carry the sound of the crowd's roar for the rest of her life. And Wade Wilson stood in the Sept of Baelor's shadow, with blood that wasn't his on the hem of his suit because the crowd had surged and someone had been trampled, and the city didn't care, because the city never cared, because King's Landing was an organism that fed on spectacle and suffering in equal measure. He found a rooftop afterward, sat on the edge with his legs dangling over an alley and flea bottom, and talked to no one. I could save them all, theoretically. Robb, I could ride north right now, find him, tell him not to break his oath to Walder Frey, tell him the Boltons are traitors, tell him that a wedding at the Twins is a death sentence. I could find Catelyn and tell her not to release Jaime because it doesn't bring her daughters home, as it just loses her leverage. I could go east, find Daenerys, tell her that the advisors she trusts will fail her, and the city she conquers will break her, and the throne she wants will cost her soul. He paused. But if I change too much, none of the story happens the way it needs to. The Night King still comes, the dead still march, and whatever fragile sequence of disasters leads to people being in the right place at the right time to stop the actual apocalypse, I might break it. He pulled his mask off. Let the air hit his face. In Flea Bottom, nobody looked twice at a scarred man on a rooftop. Everyone down here was damaged. So what do I do? Save the ones I can reach? Protect Sansa like Ned asked? Find Arya before she vanishes into a revenge arc that turns her into a child assassin? Go north and help Jon figure out that the White Walkers are real before he has to watch Hardhome happen. We're halfway through this story, and it's only getting more intense. If you're enjoying it, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next one. And tell me in the comments, which character would you drop into Westeros? The realm is always hungry for new players. He sat on that rooftop for an hour. Below, the city churned. Ravens flew from the Red Keep carrying news of Lord Stark's execution to every corner of the Seven Kingdoms. In the Riverlands, Robb Stark would receive the news, and his bannermen would declare him king in the north. On Dragonstone, Stannis would see it as proof that the usurper's line was rotten. Across the narrow sea, Daenerys Targaryen would not hear of it for months, but when she did, and it would confirm what she already believed, that Westeros was a broken kingdom waiting for a conqueror. And beyond the wall, the Night King didn't care about any of it. The dead don't follow politics. Wade made his decision on that rooftop. Not a grand decision, not a heroic declaration. A small, human, imperfect decision made by a man who couldn't die in a world that killed everyone. He would protect the ones Ned Stark asked him to protect. He found Sansa first. She was in her chambers in the Red Keep, surrounded by Lannister guards and the ruins of her innocence. Joffrey had made her look at her father's head on a spike. She was 13 years old, and she was learning, in the hardest possible way, that the world she'd been promised, the songs, the knights, the handsome prince, was a lie told to little girls to keep them quiet. Wade couldn't get past the guards. He wasn't trying to. Not yet. But he positioned himself where she could see him when they walked her through the corridors, and he said one thing clearly, so she would remember it. "Your father asked me to watch over you. When you need help, find the man in red." She looked at him with eyes that hadn't finished crying, and didn't say a word, but she heard him. Wade knew she heard him because Sansa Stark survived this entire story by hearing the things people said and remembering them long after the speakers thought she'd forgotten. Arya was gone. Yoren had her, dressed as a boy, heading north with a Night's Watch recruitment party. Wade tracked the group to the King's Road but didn't follow. Arya's path, Harrenhal, the Hound, Braavos, the Faceless Men, was a path she needed to walk, and it would forge her into the weapon that killed the Night King. He couldn't interfere with that. Shouldn't. Narrative necessity, he told the sky. The story needs her to become who she becomes, even though what she goes through to get there is... He stopped, swallowed. Let's just say I relate to the getting tortured until you become something else. Pipeline more than I'd like to. He returned to Tyrion that night. The Hand of the King was drinking alone, which was Tyrion's default state when the world was falling apart, which was always. "Stark is dead," Wade said. "I heard. You could have stopped it." "No." Tyrion's voice was flat. "I couldn't. My sister wanted it. Joffrey wanted it. My father, from wherever he's commanding his war, orchestrated the entire sequence. I am Hand of the King, and in the Hand's power extends exactly as far as the King allows, which in Joffrey's case is nowhere useful." Wade sat down. "I need your help." "With what?" "War's coming. Real war. Not 5 idiots fighting over a chair. I mean the war. Ice and fire. Dead things marching south. The end of everything. You've mentioned this before. The frozen dead beyond the wall. They're real, Tyrion. Realer than politics. And while everyone down here is busy murdering each other over who gets to sit on a throne made from swords, up north there's an army that doesn't sleep, doesn't eat, doesn't stop, and adds every corpse to its ranks. Every soldier who dies in your war of 5 kings is a soldier who fights for the Night King when winter comes." Tyrion drank, thought, drank again. "Assuming, hypothetically, that I believe you about magical frozen apocalypse. What do you want me to do?" "Survive. Get smart. Get ready. Because when the time comes, the living are going to need every brain and every sword, and your brain is worth more than most people's armies." Tyrion looked at him. "That might be the kindest thing anyone's ever said to me. Don't get used to it. I'm usually much funnier than this." Varys came for him on a Tuesday. Wade knew it was a Tuesday because he'd started tracking the days by the city's rhythms. Fish markets on Monday, executions on Wednesday, Cersei's wine deliveries every other Thursday. And Tuesday was the day the spider's little birds whispered loudest through the walls of the Red Keep. They met in the tunnels beneath the castle, Varys's territory, a labyrinth of secret passages built by Targaryen kings who understood that the difference between a fortress and a tomb was knowing the way out. The spy master stood in the torchlight, wearing silk robes and an expression of practiced pleasantness that concealed the most dangerous mind in King's Landing, which in a city containing Tyrion, Cersei, and Littlefinger was genuinely saying something. "I've been patient," Varys said. "I've watched you, and I've listened. My little birds have followed you through the streets, and what they report troubles me. Your child spy network followed me. That's creepy, Varys. That's like, even by the standards of this show, which has incest and zombie babies, the child spy thing is You speak to walls, to empty rooms, to the sky. You address invisible audiences with information that no living person should possess. You predicted the wildfire caches. You knew about my correspondence with Illyrio before I sent the latest raven. You described the manner of Lord Stark's death before it happened and did nothing to prevent it. Varys stepped closer. Who are you? Wade leaned against the tunnel wall. Damp stone, rat sounds in the dark, the smell of the city's sewage filtering down from above because King's Landing was, at its foundation, built on waste. I told you, I'm from somewhere else. Everyone is from somewhere else. Specificity, please. Fine. Specific. I'm from a fictional universe that exists inside a larger fictional universe that's being narrated as a YouTube script inside a reality that may itself be fictional, depending on your philosophical framework. I have a healing factor derived from a mutant gene activated through military torture. I know the future because I watched it as entertainment. And I'm talking to you in a tunnel because you're the only person in this city who might actually believe me, since you've spent your entire life collecting impossible truths. Varys studied him. The eunuch's face was a mask, always, but behind the mask was a mechanism, calculating, sorting, weighing every word against every possible interpretation. And I don't believe you, Varys said. But I believe you believe it. And I believe you know things that my network cannot explain, which makes you the most dangerous kind of variable, the kind I cannot predict. So what do you do with me? That depends entirely on what you intend. I intend to keep people alive who this story kills. Whose story? Wade looked at him. Yours. Everyone's. The story where the 7 kingdoms tear themselves apart, fighting over a chair, while an army of frozen corpses marches south to end the human race. That story. I'm trying to change the ending. Varys was quiet for a long time. Water dripped, rats scurried. The tunnels breathed with the slow patience of stone that had witnessed 3 centuries of Targaryen dynasty and their ugly, bloody end. I serve the realm, Varys said finally. As I know. If you truly wish to save lives, we may find common purpose. I know that too. Varys nodded. Then we have an understanding, for now. He turned to leave, then paused. One question. You said you know how this story ends. Do I survive it? Wade said nothing, which was, for Wade Wilson, the loudest possible answer. Varys left without another word. Littlefinger was different. Petter Baelish did not come to Wade through tunnels or subtlety. He came through leverage, or what he believed was leverage. A messenger delivered a sealed note to Wade's chambers, inviting him to a meeting in one of Baelish's brothels. The note smelled of perfume and ambition in roughly equal parts. Wade went because refusing Littlefinger was more dangerous than meeting him. A man denied the chance to manipulate you face to face, simply manipulated you from a distance, and Baelish's distance game involved poison, hired knives, and elaborate conspiracies that destroyed entire families. He found Littlefinger in a private room upholstered in Myrish silk, drinking wine that cost more than most small folk earned in a year. The man was smaller than the show conveyed, sharper too. His eyes moved like a predator's, tracking, assessing, calculating the value of everything they landed on. The unkillable man, Baelish said. King's Landing talks of little else. King's Landing should talk about the sewage situation. Seriously, the public health infrastructure here is medieval. Which, I realize, yes, it literally is medieval. But still, Baelish smiled. And it was the smile of a man who had climbed from minor lordship to master of coin to shadow power behind half the realm's political upheavals through sheer ruthless intelligence and absolute absence of loyalty. I understand you know things, Baelish said. Secrets, futures, the kind of knowledge that men kill for. The kind of knowledge men die for too. Ask Ned Stark. Something flickered behind Baelish's eyes. Satisfaction quickly buried. He had orchestrated Ned's downfall, betrayed him in the throne room, lied to his face, set the entire sequence in motion because chaos was a ladder and Ned Stark's honor was a rung he'd needed to step on. "I have a proposal," Baelish said. "Your knowledge, combined with my network, could reshape the realm. I could offer you wealth, position, and a seat at the table where the real decisions are made. Not the small council theater, but the actual mechanisms of power." Wade tilted his head. "Littlefinger, Pete, can I call you Pete? Here's the thing. You can't manipulate me because I have nothing you can threaten, nothing you can offer, and nothing you can take. I can't die. I don't want money. I don't want power. I don't want a title, a castle, a wife, or a seat at any table. You're a man whose entire skill set is finding what people want and exploiting it, and you've just met someone who wants nothing you can provide." Baelish's smile didn't waver, but his eyes went cold. "Every man wants something. Sure, I want chimichangas, but you don't have those. I want my face to stop looking like a topographical map of human suffering, but your meisters can't fix that. And I want to save some specific people from dying in specific ways, which is a goal you'd actively undermine because most of those deaths serve your interests." Wade stood. "So here's my counter-proposal. Stay away from me. Stay away from the Stark girls, and when the time comes, and it will, don't go to Winterfell. Just don't." He left Baelish sitting in his brothel with an expression that Wade had never seen on the show. Genuine uncertainty. Not fear, not yet, but the uncomfortable recognition that his ladder had encountered a wall he couldn't climb. He's not going to listen. Across the narrow sea, in a city of pyramids and chains and dust, Daenerys Targaryen heard the rumor from a merchant captain whose ship had docked at Myreen's harbor with a cargo of wine and gossip. An unkillable man in King's Landing. A demon, some said. A champion of R'hllor, said others. A madman who spoke to empty air and predicted deaths before they happened and had walked into Cersei Lannister's presence and walked out again, which was something armies hadn't managed. He healed from any wound. No sword could finish him, no poison took root. He'd been stabbed through the chest by the Kingsguard and laughed about it. Daenerys sat on her throne in the Great Pyramid and listened with the particular stillness of a woman who had walked into fire and emerged with dragons. Impossible things did not surprise her, so she had birthed impossibility. She was impossibility made flesh and silver hair and violet eyes and 3 growing creatures that the world had believed extinct. "Find out more," she told Jorah Mormont. Jorah, loyal to the marrow and in love with his queen in the way that doomed men love, completely, uselessly, beautifully, sent inquiries through the network of traders and spies that connected Essos to Westeros across the water. The reports came back inconsistent. The man was a sellsword, a demon, a foreign sorcerer, a fool. The only consistent detail was the healing, verified by multiple witnesses who had seen steel enter his body and the wounds seal like water closing over a dropped stone. Daenerys filed the information away. She had a city to rule, slaves to free, and a continent to reconquer. Like an unkillable man in King's Landing was interesting but distant. If he mattered, he would find his way into her story eventually. Everyone did. Far to the north, farther than merchants sailed, farther than ravens flew, in the lands of always winter where the living had no business and the dead had no rest. The Night King stood on a ridge of ice and looked south with eyes like frozen sapphires. He did not hear rumors. He did not rely on spies or merchants. The Night King's awareness was older than that, woven into the ice itself, connected to the weirwood network through the mark he'd placed on the 3-eyed raven's arm and the ancient magic the children of the forest had driven into his chest with a shard of dragonglass 10,000 years before. He sensed things, disruptions, the pulse of magic in a world that had almost forgotten it, and the dragons in the east. He felt their heat like sunlight through a frozen window. Melisandre's fires on Dragonstone, a candle flicker. The weirwood network Bran Stark was learning to navigate. A doorway he could press against. And now, something else. Something in King's Landing that shouldn't exist. A life force that didn't behave like life. That broke and reformed, a heartbeat that refused to flatline no matter what was done to the body that carried it. The Night King didn't think in human terms. He didn't have curiosity the way living things did, but he had purpose, and purpose required assessment, and assessment told him that this anomaly was worth watching. Because the Night King's power was, at its core, dominion over death. He raised the dead. He commanded the dead. Death was his army, his weapon. I was preparing to leave. The city was preparing to leave. The city had taught him what it could, which factions moved where, who could be trusted to an extent that was almost but not quite zero, and the precise speed at which Cersei could mobilize assassins when sufficiently irritated. She'd sent 4 teams in the past 2 weeks. The first had been conventional killers. Wade had sent them back, tied together with a note reading, "Try harder." The second had been a poisoner. The poison had given him cramps for an hour before his healing factor flushed it out, and he'd used the resulting downtime to narrate a detailed review of Westerosi cuisine to the ceiling of his chamber. And the third had been Sir Mandan Moore of the Kingsguard, who Wade had disarmed, stripped of his white cloak, and sent back to Cersei, wearing the cloak as a toga. The fourth team hadn't come back at all, not because Wade had killed them, but because they'd heard about the first 3 and deserted. "I respect the persistence," Wade said, packing a satchel with stolen food and a map he'd bought from a flea-bottom cartographer whose accuracy was questionable but whose prices were excellent. "But it's time to go north. The plot's moving. Robb Stark's winning his war, which means Tywin's getting desperate, which means the Red Wedding is approaching, and I need to be in the Riverlands before that invitation goes out." He looked up. "I know what you're thinking. He couldn't save Ned. How's he going to save Robb? And honestly, fair question. I don't know if I can change the big beats. This story has momentum. George R.R. Martin built it like a machine where every gear connects to every other gear, and pulling one out might collapse the whole thing." He paused. "But there's a difference between the Red Wedding and Ned's execution. Ned chose his fate. He chose honor over survival, and I respect that, even though it was stupid. Robb doesn't choose the Red Wedding. Robb gets betrayed. Robb dies because Walder Frey is a petty old man, and Rose Bolton is a cold-blooded opportunist, and Tywin Lannister is the most dangerous puppet master on this continent." He strapped his katanas to his back. "Robb doesn't deserve what's coming. Catelyn doesn't deserve what's coming. And the Stark soldiers who die at that feast, men who put down their weapons because they were eating bread and salt under a host's roof, protected by guest right, the most sacred law in Westeros. They don't deserve it either." He headed for the gate. Maximum effort. The King's Road north was a river of refugees, soldiers, and the displaced. War had cracked the Riverlands open like an egg, and everything that spilled out, small folk with nothing, hedge knights with no lord, orphans, widows, bandits, and the Brotherhood without banners, was flowing in every direction at once. Wade moved through it faster than a man on foot should have, partly because his stamina was superhuman, and partly because people tended to clear the road for a heavily scarred man in red leather, carrying 2 swords on his back, who periodically talked to things that weren't there. He passed through the ruins of villages that the Mountain's men had burned. Gregor Clegane, 8 feet of armored cruelty on legs, had been unleashed on the Riverlands as Tywin's blunt instrument of terror. The evidence was everywhere. Burned farms, bodies in ditches, wells poisoned, crops destroyed. The small folk of the Riverlands were paying the price for a war between lords they'd never met over a throne they'd never sit on, and their suffering was so commonplace that even the show had only gestured at it because there wasn't enough screen time for the full scope of feudal war's human cost. "This is the part of Game of Thrones that doesn't make good TV," Wade said, passing a woman carrying 2 children through ash. The aftermath. The people who aren't characters, who don't have names, who exist between the plot points. Nobody writes fan theories about them. Nobody cosplays as Burned Farmer number 12. He stopped walking. But they're the reason any of this matters. The Game of Thrones is a game for lords. The stakes are real for everyone else. He gave the woman what food he had and kept moving north. Walder Frey used as a toll road, and a Walder Frey used as a toll road and a political weapon with equal enthusiasm, squatted over the river like a spider over its web. Old Walder had held this crossing for decades through spite, fertility, and a vindictive patience that outlasted better men. He had more children and grandchildren than he could name, more grudges than he could count, and a wounded pride that Robb Stark had inflated into a killing rage by breaking his marriage pact to wed Talisa instead of a Frey girl. Wade stood on the southern bank and looked at the castle and talked to the audience. Okay, here we are. The twins. The Red Wedding happens right there, in that hall, in 11 days. Robb Stark, Catelyn Stark, Talisa Stark, who's pregnant, by the way, because this show didn't think the Red Wedding was devastating enough without adding a pregnant woman to the body count. And several hundred northern soldiers are going to walk into that castle, eat Walder Frey's bread and salt, and die. Bolton men will wear Frey colors. The Freys will bar the doors. The Rains of Castamere will play. And the king in the north will die with crossbow bolts in his chest, and his mother's scream will be the last sound before they cut her throat. He was not smiling. I've been making jokes this entire story. Fourth wall breaks. Pop culture references. Chimichanga bits. That's what I do. That's the character. That's the mask. And I don't mean the red one. He touched his face. But this is the Red Wedding, and I'm not going to joke about it. Because I'm standing here right now with the power to change it, and if I don't, if I let it happen because of narrative structure or timeline preservation or some cosmic screenwriting rule, then I'm not the character I think I am. He crossed the river at a shallow ford downstream and made camp in the riverland's brush within sight of the twins. For 3 days, he watched the preparations. Frey soldiers, arriving in numbers that didn't match a wedding celebration. Bolton banners appearing among the Frey forces. The flayed man of the Dreadfort, a sigil that looked exactly as welcoming as the family it represented. Supply wagons carrying more weapons than food. On the 4th day, he infiltrated the castle. Getting in was the easy part. The twins were crowded with Frey kin arriving for the wedding, and Wade Wilson, masked, scarred, posed as a sellsword hired for security, which was plausible because Walder Frey was paranoid enough to hire additional swords and cheap enough to hire disreputable ones. He found the hall where it would happen. The feast hall of the twins. Long tables, stone walls, a gallery above where musicians would play, where the crossbowmen would stand. He noted the positions, the barred doors, the layout that would turn a wedding feast into a killing floor. Then he went to find Robb Stark. The king in the north was camped with his army south of the twins, preparing to cross for the ceremony that would seal the alliance he needed to retake the north from the Ironborn. As he was young, younger than Wade expected, even knowing the casting. A boy carrying the weight of a kingdom on shoulders that hadn't finished broadening, surrounded by men twice his age who called him Your Grace, and followed him because his father had been Ned Stark and his sword had been sharp and his wolf had been terrifying. Grey Wind. The direwolf was the key. Wade knew, from the show, from the script, from the story, that Grey Wind had been agitated before the Red Wedding. The wolf had sensed the trap. Animals often did. And Robb had ignored it because ignoring the wolf meant he could walk into the feast and pretend everything was fine and honor the alliance he needed. Wade approached under a flag of parley, a concept he'd learned from the medieval warfare section of the story's background material, which he appreciated the screenwriter including because otherwise he'd have been shot with arrows immediately. He requested an audience with the king in the north and was brought to Robb's tent by guards who searched him, confiscated his katanas, and were visibly unsettled by his appearance. Robb Stark looked at him across a campaign table covered in maps and said, "Who are you?" "A man who knew your father." The tent went silent. Robb's hand moved to the pommel of his sword. His bannermen shifted. The name of Ned Stark was sacred in this army. The fallen lord whose execution had started the war, whose honor they fought to avenge, whose memory held the Northern Coalition together through blood and snow and grief. "Explain," Robb said. His voice carried the authority of a king and the exhaustion of a boy. "I was in King's Landing when your father died. I tried to save him. He refused to leave because he was..." Wade paused. "Because he was your father, honorable to the end. He asked me to protect his daughters. I've been doing that as best I can, which given the state of this continent is not as well as I'd like." "You were in King's Landing." "I was. I can tell you that your father was betrayed by Littlefinger, condemned by Cersei, and killed by Joffrey's cruelty. None of which is news to you. What is news is that you're about to be betrayed the same way." Robb's eyes hardened. "Speak plainly." "Walder Frey is going to murder you at the wedding, him and Rose Bolton. Tywin Lannister arranged it. They'll let you eat and drink. They'll invoke guest right, and then they'll kill you, your wife, your mother, and every soldier in that hall. Now the musicians are crossbowmen. The doors will be barred. Bolton's men are wearing Frey colors inside the castle right now." The silence in the tent was absolute. "That is a monstrous accusation," said Great John Umber from behind Robb's shoulder. "Guest right is sacred, even Walder Frey." "Walder Frey is a petty, vindictive old man who's been stewing in humiliation since Robb married Talisa instead of one of his daughters. And Rose Bolton has been calculating the cost of loyalty versus the reward of treachery since the war started, and Tywin offered him the north. The Freys get revenge, the Boltons get Winterfell. Tywin gets the war ended without spending another Lannister soldier. Everyone wins except the Starks, who die." Robb stared at him. "How do you know this?" And there it was, as the question Wade couldn't answer honestly without sounding insane, and couldn't answer dishonestly without losing credibility. He chose a middle path, the truth framed in terms Robb could accept. "Your father told me things in the black cells, your family's enemies, their methods, their patterns. I've been following the thread since his death, watching who meets with whom, tracking the ravens and the gold. Walder Frey received a raven from Tywin Lannister 3 weeks ago. Bolton's been pulling his forces back from your vanguard for a month. Your wolf knows. Grey Wind has been restless. Listen to him." Robb looked at Grey Wind. The direwolf was outside the tent, pacing, growling at the direction of the twins. A low, persistent warning that the king in the north had been ignoring because he couldn't afford to believe it. "Please," Wade said. And the word cost him something because Wade Wilson did not say please, did not. Robb Stark did not walk into the hall. He wanted to. Every instinct of duty, every obligation of the Alliance, every voice in his war council except the scarred strangers told him to honor his commitment, attend the feast, make amends with Walder Frey, and secure the crossing he needed. To do otherwise was to insult a lord whose bridge he required, to show weakness before his bannermen, and to listen to a madman over the council of experienced warriors. But Grey Wind wouldn't stop growling, and Robb Stark, for all the mistakes he'd made, the broken oath, the secret marriage, the boy's pride dressed in a king's crown, was still Ned Stark's son, and Ned Stark had once told him that a direwolf's instincts were worth more than a lord's promises. He sent an envoy instead, Small John Umber, 30 men, gifts of wine and gold in apology, and a letter from the king explaining illness. Fever, the Maester confirmed, because the Maester was loyal and would confirm what his king needed confirmed. The wedding of Edmure Tully to Roslyn Fry would proceed with the bride's family and the groom. The king would follow when recovered. Walder Frey received the envoy in his hall and smiled a smile that curdled the milk on the feast tables. The plan required Robb Stark in that room. The crossbowmen were in the gallery. Bolton's men were in Frey armor. The doors were ready to be barred, but the king in the north was not there. What followed was a night of chaos. Wade had positioned himself on the ridge above the twins with a stolen crossbow and his katanas and the grim understanding that changing the Red Wedding didn't prevent its architects from trying again. Walder Frey, undenied his primary target, faced a choice: proceed with a lesser massacre that would achieve nothing strategic, or abort and pretend the preparations had been for legitimate security. He chose a third option. He seized the envoy. Small John Umber and his 30 men were taken prisoner in the feast hall. Guest right was violated. Bread and salt consumed, then chains produced, because Walder Frey's hatred was deeper than his pragmatism, and a slight unanswered was a slight that festered. Bolton, more cautious, withdrew his disguised men before dawn. Rose Bolton survived on calculation, not rage, and a failed ambush with the primary target absent was a calculation that returned negative value. He sent a raven to Tywin Lannister that said simply, "Delayed." The boy was warned. Robb Stark broke camp before sunrise and marched his army north. Wade found him in the pre-dawn dark, mud-splattered and grim, his crown sitting heavy on auburn hair that the torchlight turned the color of dried blood. "They took Small John?" Robb said. "I know. 30 good men. My men. Men who went there because I sent them instead of going myself. Better 30 captured than 300 dead." "Is it?" Robb's voice cracked, not with weakness, with the weight of command, with the knowledge that every decision a king makes costs someone something, and the throne doesn't let you forget it. I saved myself and sacrificed them. You saved your army, your mother, your wife, and your unborn child, and you can get the Small John back. You can't undie. Grey wind pressed against Robb's leg. The dire wolf was calm now. The warning had been heard. The trap had been avoided. And then somewhere in the animal's ancient, wolfish understanding of the world, the threat had passed. "Who are you?" Robb asked again. Not in suspicion this time, in something closer to gratitude, or its harder cousin. The recognition that a stranger had saved his life and he didn't understand why. "I'm nobody important," Wade said. "I'm not in the histories and I won't be in the songs. I'm just a guy who knew what was coming and couldn't sit still." He paused, looked up at the sky. The stars over the riverlands were the same stars over everywhere in Westeros, ancient, cold, indifferent to the wars beneath them. "That's a lie, actually," he said quietly. "I'm important. Not in the way that kings and queens and dragon riders are important. I'm important because I'm the audience. I'm the viewer. And I'm the person sitting on the other side of the screen watching this story and screaming at the characters to make different choices. And somehow, through fire magic or dimensional nonsense or the grace of a very creative writer, I ended up inside the screen. And now I have to decide what the audience would do if they could reach through the glass and touch the story." He looked back at Robb. "Ride north, Your Grace. Take back Winterfell. Win your war. And when winter comes, and it's coming, Robb, it's coming faster than anyone believes. Remember that the real enemy isn't south. It's north, far north, past the wall, past everything, and the living will need every sword and every king and every wolf when it arrives." Robb studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. Not a king's nod. A young man's nod. He go from the ridgeline. Thousands of men go from the ridgeline. Thousands of men, banners snapping, grey wind loping alongside his king. A force that should have died at the Twins, an army that history had marked for slaughter. "I changed it," Wade said. He said it to the audience. He said it to himself. He said it to the story. "I actually changed it. The Red Wedding didn't happen. Robb Stark is alive. Catelyn Stark is alive. The Northern Army survives." He sat down on the ridge. "Which means everything after this is different." "Everything. The Boltons don't take Winterfell. Or maybe they still do, differently. Sansa's story changes. Arya's story changes. Jon's story changes. Yes, the entire trajectory of the show from season 3 forward just got rewritten because I couldn't watch it happen again." He looked at his hands. Scarred. Healed. Scarred again. The endless cycle of damage and recovery that was his existence. And I don't know if that's good. I don't know if saving Robb Stark saves the world or breaks it. The Night King is still coming. The dead are still marching. Daenerys still has dragons and a destiny and a madness that might be genetic or might be circumstantial. And the sequence of disasters that puts the right people in the right place to stop the apocalypse. Maybe I just dismantled it. He looked up. Not at the sky. At the audience. Directly. Without humor. Without performance. Without the mask. "Would you have done different?" The Riverlands stretched out below him, green and golden and bleeding from a war that might now take a different shape. He didn't have a joke. He didn't have a quip. He had a question he couldn't answer and a future he could no longer predict. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Wade Wilson's life, and his life included a torture-based mutation program, multiple dismemberments, and a brief but memorable encounter with a time-traveling cyborg. Robb Stark marched north with his army intact. The Red Wedding that wasn't rippled through the political landscape like a stone dropped in still water. Or, more accurately, like a stone that should have been dropped but wasn't. leaving the water eerily undisturbed where history demanded a splash. Walder Frey held the twins with 30 northern hostages and a grievance that would outlast his remaining teeth. Rose Bolton retreated to the Dreadfort and sent ravens in every direction, recalculating his position in a war whose script had been rewritten mid-performance. Tywin Lannister in Harrenhal. He received Bolton's message and sat in silence for a very long time, which, for a man who weaponized silence the way other men weaponized swords, was the equivalent of a screaming rage. The war continued, but its shape had changed. A living Robb Stark with an intact army was a problem that the Lannister-Frey-Bolton axis had expected to solve with treachery and had now failed to solve at all. The king in the north marched on Moat Cailin, the ancient fortress that guarded the Neck, and the Ironborn garrison there, cut off from Theon's collapsed campaign and Balon Greyjoy's failing rebellion, surrendered within days. The north was reclaimed. Winterfell was retaken without the years of Bolton occupation that the original timeline demanded. And the Stark banners flew over its walls again while Robb Stark rode through the gates his father had walked through a lifetime ago. Wade didn't follow them north. He stood at a crossroads in the Riverlands, literally a place where two muddy tracks intersected near an inn that had been burned and rebuilt twice during the war, and addressed the audience for what felt like the first time in days. So, I broke the story. The Red Wedding was the hinge that everything turned on. Without it, the Boltons don't control the North. Without the Boltons, there's no Battle of the Bastards. Without the Battle of the Bastards, Jon Snow's arc changes. Sansa's arc changes. The entire political landscape that leads to the living uniting against the dead at Winterfell is different now, because Robb Stark is alive, and the North never fell. He kicked a stone down the road. And you know what? I don't care. I don't care if the timeline is broken. I don't care if the narrative structure is compromised. I saved a pregnant woman from being murdered at a dinner party. I saved a mother from watching her son die. I saved a young man who made mistakes and didn't deserve to pay for them with his entire family's blood. If the story can't survive people not being massacred at a wedding, then the story needs a rewrite. He paused. Softer now, but I'm scared. Because the Night King is still coming, and I don't know this version of the story. I was the audience. I had the script, I had the spoilers, I had the foresight. Now I'm a character in a story nobody's written yet, and for the first time since I got here, I don't know what happens next. A raven landed on a fence post beside him. It carried a message. Not for him. Ravens in Westeros didn't work that way. They flew between castles, not to scarred men standing at crossroads. But it had been blown off course by a storm, and the message was sealed with red wax and addressed to Castle Black. Wade opened it. Old habits from a life spent ignoring other people's privacy. The message was from Samwell Tarly at the Citadel. It described dragonglass deposits on Dragonstone. It begged the Lord Commander to prepare for what was coming from the north. It mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the ancient texts described a weapon against the dead that required Valyrian steel, dragonglass, and a sacrifice that the old Meisters had been too frightened to detail. Wade read it twice. Then he looked north, then south, then east toward the sea, toward Dragonstone, toward Dragonglass and the volcanic island where he'd first arrived in this world through Melisandre's fire. Well, he said, I guess I have a new quest. Find the magic rocks, figure out the ancient weapon, and somehow convince every surviving faction in Westeros that the frozen zombie apocalypse is more important than who sits on the pointy chair. He started walking east. I changed the Red Wedding. That's one miracle. Now I need another one. Several, actually. I need Robb Stark and Jon Snow to work together, which should be easier now that Robb isn't dead. I need Daenerys Targaryen to point her dragons north instead of south. No, which means convincing a woman who's spent her entire life dreaming of the Iron Throne that a throne isn't worth ruling if there's nobody left alive to kneel. I need Cersei to... Actually, no. Cersei's going to Cersei. Some things even I can't change. The road stretched ahead, muddy, war-torn, lined with the debris of a kingdom eating itself alive. Somewhere north, the dead were marching. Somewhere east, dragons were growing. Somewhere in every direction, the Game of Thrones was being played by people who didn't know the board was about to be flipped. Wade Wilson walked east through the Riverlands with 2 katanas on his back and a stolen Raven message in his pocket, and the knowledge that he'd cracked the story wide open and now had to live inside the cracks. "Fourth wall check," he said. "You still there?" "Good. Because here's what I need you to understand. I'm not the hero of this story. Game of Thrones doesn't have heroes. It has survivors and corpses and the people in between who haven't figured out which one they're going to be. I'm a guy with a healing factor and a big mouth and the fading memory of a script that doesn't apply anymore." He looked over his shoulder. The twins were a distant smudge on the horizon. The bridge where hundreds should have died stood intact, its stones unblooded, its guest right unbroken. But Robb Stark is alive, and maybe that's enough. Maybe that's the whole point of this episode. Not that I'm unkillable. Everybody knows that. It's the least interesting thing about me. The interesting thing is that I cared. In a story about power and thrones and who gets to sit in the big chair. Well, the guy from another dimension didn't want the chair. He just wanted to stop a wedding from becoming a funeral. The sun was setting over the Riverlands. Red and gold, Lannister colors, painting the sky in the livery of the family that still held the Iron Throne. In the east, the first stars appeared over the narrow sea, where dragons circled and a queen was learning that conquest and liberation were different words for the same fire. And in the far north, beyond the wall, beyond the reach of ravens and kings and men who talked to audiences that existed in other dimensions, the Night King raised his hand and 10,000 corpses stood. Winter was coming. It was always coming. That was the promise and the curse of this world. That no matter what you saved, no matter who you rescued, no matter how many weddings you prevented from becoming massacres, the cold was patient and the dead were endless, and the long night would test every living soul before it was done. Wade Wilson kept walking. "To be not continued," he said, "because we don't say that. We say..." "What do we say?" He grinned under the mask. "Maximum effort." Wade Wilson came to Westeros through fire and accident, armed with 2 swords, an indestructible body, and the most dangerous weapon anyone could carry in a world built on secrets: knowledge of how the story ends. He cracked jokes in throne rooms and bled in dungeons and talked to an audience that no one else could see, and every person he met thought him mad, divine, or dangerous, depending on which god they prayed to and how much he'd annoyed them. But beneath the fourth wall, breaks and the chimichanga references and the relentless, exhausting comedy that was both his armor and his curse, Wade Wilson did something that almost nobody in Game of Thrones managed to do. He changed the story. Not by conquering, not by claiming a throne or burning a city or marching an army. He changed it by standing in front of a young king and saying, "Don't walk into that room." The Red Wedding didn't happen. The North endures. And the Merc with a mouth walks east toward dragonglass and dragons and a war against the dead that will demand everything he has and more. Robb Stark is alive. Catelyn Stark is alive. And somewhere, in whatever dimension holds the audience, listening to this, and a man in a red mask is looking through the screen and asking the only question that matters. Was it worth breaking the story to save them? You already know his answer. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe.